In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about the impacts of different events on your personality.
So now you can understand sort of some of the lower order games, and you can even understand some of the higher order roles. Like you could basically articulate in some sense what it means to be a student. But if you go up the hierarchy, because good person, a subset of good person could be good student, you can kind of articulate what it means to be a good student, although you can't fully articulate it. But if you go at levels above that, like be a good citizen or be a good person, it gets more and more difficult to fully articulate because, of course, it's more and more abstract and it encompasses more and more territory. And so by the time you're at the top of the hierarchy, so to speak, be a good person, well, it's a much more complex phenomena than you can articulate. It can't be fully articulated. Matt, that hierarchy that I just showed you. We talked about the idea that if you hit something disruptive in your life, that the magnitude of your response is proportionate to the elevation of the level, right? It's much more damaging to be accused of being a bad person, seriously, than it is for someone to complain about, which side of the plate you happen to put the fork on. So, and I think you can say that you can sort of think of those nested hierarchies of value as nested hierarchies of, they're almost like maps in a sense. They're little units of ways that you know how to maneuver in the world. And what that means is that as you go up the hierarchy, the map is larger and larger and more comprehensive. And so if you blow out someone's map of like which fork to put on the table, that's not so bad. They can just rectify that in no time flat. It leaves 99.99% of their personality intact. But if you fail a crucial exam, for example, and part of the reason that you're a student is because you want to go to medical school, that'll blow out like 50 or 60% of your personality, or at least it'll feel that way. And that's because what's happening is that the structure that you use to regulate the relationship between you and the world has become damaged at a high level, and that invalidates, like if you're not a student, if you're not a good student anymore, then all of the sub-factors that make up being a good student might be invalid. And you might have put a lot of effort into being a good student. And so if all of a sudden you're not that, you have to ask yourself, well, what exactly am I? And where are all the errors? And that's an extraordinarily difficult cognitive problem because you've built that structure, who knows, over what period of time. It might be 15 years or something like that, and you've been practicing building that structure. And it's a huge part of your identity, because someone might say, well, what are you even? And you'd say a student. They might say, what do you do? But they could easily say, what are you? I'm a student. Well, if you're not a student, at least insofar as you define student, then just exactly what are you? All right. So Nietzsche, when he packed a lot of information into a sentence or a paragraph, you have to be very careful reading him. And Jung is like this too, because he'll throw some information at you that's packed into a paragraph, and it'll be the kind of information that disrupts high-level structures. You won't even notice it, and it's because he's so subversive. And he wanted to do that. It was an aim of his. He had his reasons to do it. He would say that you have to be broken down to nothing before you can be rebuilt. So it's like a trip to the underworld thing. So, and I suppose in many ways that's what philosophy is. You don't learn a new principle without allowing old principles to disappear, because you can't have the new principle and the old principle at the same time. So almost always any radical learning involves the destruction of old habits and of action and perception. And that's a kind of death. Like it's an abstract death, But that doesn't make it not painful. And the thing is, if the abstract death is of sufficient intensity, it can drive people to suicide, because they regard killing themselves as easier than making the reparation, facing the anxiety and the suffering and going through the intolerably difficult task of retooling. They may well regard that as more emotionally threatening than death. And so, that's not that rare, suicide is rare, but it's not that rare. So, and it's certainly a behavior that I suspect everyone here has known someone who was touched by suicide in some way. You know, it might not be your family member, even your extended family member, but the probability that you know someone who committed suicide is extremely, extremely likely. So Nietzsche is a very dangerous thinker. The only person I know who kind of approaches him in that regard is Jung. And Jung is actually less troublesome because a lot of what Dostoevsky offers is destruction. It's intelligent, brilliant destruction, but he doesn't really offer a solution. He sort of sketches out the possibilities of a solution, and he died young. And then, in many ways, what happened was that Jung picked up where Nietzsche left off and tried to solve the problems that Nietzsche left unsolved. So it was Nietzsche, for example, in some sense, along with Dostoevsky, who really definitively announced the death of God at the end of the 19th century. And that left people, in some ways, bereft of belief. And we're going to talk about why that's so important in a moment. What Jung was doing was trying to rescue the father from the underworld, in a sense. He tried to go back to the religious traditions that Nietzsche had described as fatally anachronistic and demolished by the claims of science. He attempted to go back to those religious traditions and reassess them from a psychological perspective to pull back the necessary meaning that was embedded in them so that people could reunite with their culture and in principle not be so prone to pathological belief systems like ideology that tend to rush in where there's a gap. You know, and Nietzsche said very clearly, and Dostoevsky knew this as well, by the end of the 19th century, is that the death of God would mean that people would turn en masse to rationalistic ideologies, and that would be murderous. They knew that was coming, and that's an amazing prediction. It really is an amazing prediction. It just shows you how thoroughly they understood the structure.